Hello, everyone, and welcome to the PAPERI Bright Minds Series organized by the Pan-African BGS Education and Research Initiative, PAPERI. My name is Dr. Wafa Rashid, founder and chair of Pan-African BGS Education Research Initiative, PAPERI, and I will be your host for today's session. The Bright Minds Series highlights leading scientists whose work is advancing genetics, genomics, and biomedical research globally, while inspiring the next generation of researchers and innovators. Today, we are truly honored to welcome Professor Johnny Mahlangu. Before we begin, I would also like to extend my warm congratulations to Professor Mahlangu on his recent recognition by the South African Medical Research Council. This is a well-deserved acknowledgement of your outstanding leadership and contributions to strengthening scientific excellence and health research. Johnny Mahlangu is a professor of hematology and the academic head of the Department of Molecular Medicine and Hematology in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of the Witwatersrand, as well as the National Health Laboratory Service. He is also head of clinical hematology at the Charlotte Maxeke Johannesburg Academic Hospital. Johnny completed his undergraduate and postgraduate training in science and medicine at the University of the Witwatersrand, acquiring qualification as hematologist and a clinical hematology subspecialist through College of Medicine of South Africa. His primary area of research focused on novel therapies for bleeding disorders, for which he has acted as principal investigator in over 100 international multicentre studies. He has published numerous peer-reviewed journal articles, many in high-impact journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, Blood, and GTH. He has presented more than 700 oral talks and poster abstracts at national and international scientific meetings. His academic citizenship, including 50 memberships of national and international scientific committees. Johnny has received over 30 honors and awards, including 2 Vice Chancellor Awards for Research and Academic Citizenship, as well as national and international awards, academic leadership awards. Professor Johnny Mahlangu, welcome to the PAPERI Bright Minds Series. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rashid, for inviting me to participate in this very important forum.
Thank you. Let's begin with your scientific journey and what shaped it. First question, looking back at your career, what key scientific or clinical questions most shaped your path in hematostasis and gene therapy?
So I took a little bit of a long way to arrive where I am at the moment. As you correctly pointed out, I started on a science track before I decided that I would go and do medicine and then subsequently specialize and subspecialize in hematology. And I think by and large, the biggest motivation were the mentors that all of us, in fact, should be valuing. My mentor was a hematologist at the time when I was doing my science undergraduate. And quite logically, when I finished medicine, he invited me to consider specializing in hematology. The hematology field, as you know, is a very broad field. It includes, of course, benign hematology, malignant hematology, and a whole range of other specialities and subspecialties in between. And I'm a trained oncologist, and it was a little bit later after starting to practice hematology that I realized that there were very few people who were looking after people with hemostatic disorders, and there were very few individuals that were interested in that field. That was the main reason, actually, for me to focus on that field.
And how has working as an intersection of research, clinical care, and policy influenced the way you think about innovation in medicine?
So it's actually been a very fulfilling, space to be in. I just happen to be having my hand in quite a few, areas. Where I'm based at the moment, I run the diagnostic hematology lab. Essentially, I also run a number of research labs, but I also am in charge of the hematology, the benign hematology at the Maxeke Johannesburg Hospital. So the most fulfilling part is seeing the whole spectrum of the journey of a person who arrives in front of us. From the time when they get seen either by us or our colleagues in internal medicine or surgery, to the time when they get investigated and a therapeutic plan is put in place. And of course, we are all wanting to advance science in general, and that is my biggest passion at the moment. I strongly believe that if we don't advance science, we'll remain consumers of knowledge forever. So that bit, in fact, is what keeps me going almost on a daily basis, as and when one sees the patients. It's logical that we should ask the relevant questions, which questions then you pursue in both the clinical setup or in the lab setup.
From that perspective, let's move into gene therapy and its clinical realities. From your experience in hemophilia gene therapy trials, what lessons have been most important for translating gene therapy from concept to clinical reality?
So gene therapy for bleeding disorders, in particular hemophilia, has been coming for some time, almost 6 or 7 decades. And I think the final push came in when we went beyond the proof of concept almost a decade ago, with the understanding, of course, that we are able to deliver a functional gene using adeno-associated viral particles. So when that happened, most of us, in fact, were very excited. When one looks back in the last decade, there has been in excess of 50 studies in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. About a third of those would be in the phase 3 study. In other words, these are efficacy and safety studies in humans, and the preceding ones, the phase 1, phase 2, would be largely the safety studies. What has been particularly exciting, of course, now with hindsight, is seeing patients who are born with a lifelong bleeding diathesis, phenotype change, but not just the phenotype, but also their quality of life change, and they begin to have certainty about what they want to do in life in general. And that has been probably the most exciting part. It's not easy, of course, to arrive there, but once patients have had gene therapy, the change in their lives is actually very difficult to describe. It's only when you speak to patients that you realize, oh my goodness, this is what it means. Yeah.
That's very insightful. Building on that, what are some of the common misconceptions that clinicians or patients still have about gene therapy?
I think one has to recognize that it is a deep science and an evolving science. So we have a number of levels of understanding within gene therapy. I think the most important part of the misunderstanding is that sometimes people don't make a distinction between the gene therapy I'm doing, which is essentially gene transfer. So I don't change someone's genetic constitution. but I provide an environment in which they're able to produce a protein that they were born unable to produce through gene transfer. And that is probably the most important misconception that people have, is that by giving gene therapy, sometimes people think that we are playing God, and certainly we shouldn't be playing God. And there's no intention, I think, at least for some of us, to try to be a superior human being like God. The second misunderstanding is that it is actually a functional cure as opposed to a genetic cure, the way we've actually done it. In fact, the next generation of gene therapy may well be a genetic cure, and that is what we refer to as gene editing, which is currently evolving. So a functional cure, we mean that we are able, through genomics and genetics, produce the missing protein, but in fact, the missing protein is able to correct the phenotype without changing the genetic makeup of the individual. So the functionality is corrected, but the individual will still be able to, for example, in the context of hemophilia, which is an X-linked condition, will still be able to pass those genes to their offspring. Hemophilia is an X-linked condition, therefore males are the people who are affected, and females are carriers. So they'll still be able to pass the genes to their daughters, who will be carriers later on. So that's the second misconception. And then the third one, and the one that I think we're starting to come into terms with, is that we actually don't know what we don't know about gene therapy. There's a lot that we don't know, and we are beginning to know some of the things. For example, the currently available hemophilia A gene therapy, we didn't know that over time it may wane away. In other words, the expression of the protein might come down over time. In contradistinction, if one looks at hemophilia B, and I've done both, the expression actually remains consistent, at least for the last 12 years. And that is the latest report we've had in the patients that had gene therapy 12 years ago. It doesn't change in hemophilia B, but in hemophilia A, obviously, there's a lot that we need to learn and understand. It seemed to be waning away over time. And that is something that sometimes patients, caregivers, and other doctors may not understand. We certainly don't understand why it wanes away, but we do understand that in the case of hemophilia A, the expression may well be going down.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This naturally brings us to the question of equity and the global health. Gene therapy is often discussed as a breakthrough, but access remains uneven. So, what does responsible innovation mean to you in this context?
This is actually the most important motivation for some of us. We are committed not just to individuals, we are also committed to communities. And in fact, at community level, you're absolutely right. It's not just the gene therapy, it's all genetic medicine is initially very unaffordable and inaccessible over time. What it really means for some of us who live in low to middle income country is that we should continue to innovate to make sure that our communities, in fact, can access this medicine over time. I just came back now from a World Federation of Haemophilia Congress in Malaysia. And in fact, that wish and goal seemed to be well on its way in making gene therapy accessible. The current, and I'm not sure if you are aware, the current pricing regimen for gene therapy is way, way, way out. We're talking about just over $3 million US per shot. It is a once-off medication, but it costs a lot of money. And I met in the WFH Congress Chinese colleagues who can produce the same gene therapy at a tenth of that cost. And they've already obviously started to walk the talk in the direction of bringing the prices down and certainly making sure that there is an element of equity. So I'm looking forward to many, many more of those innovations coming our way in order to be able to make this medication, this important medication, accessible to our patients.
So, how can African institutions and research play a more central role, not only as trial sites, but as leaders in gene therapy development?
I think one of the critical inflection points that we experienced recently is the COVID-19 pandemic. That resulted in a fair amount of expertise, interest, as well as infrastructure being set up in Africa. And I'm hoping that, in fact, we can repurpose all of those into genomic medicine and in particular gene therapy, because the infrastructure and the expertise would be exactly the same as those required, for example, for the vaccine production. All we need is to focus on the relevant genes that we think, in fact, should be tackled first. And later on. So with the recent experience of COVID-19, I think there's huge opportunity for us to be able to repurpose a lot of the material in order to be able to take the genomic story forward.
So to make this is a reality, systems and policies play a critical role. So what regulatory or health system adaptations are most urgently needed to make advanced therapies sustainable in low and middle income countries?
I think one needs initially a very broad approach that says all of us need an element of education. When I was contemplating doing gene therapy, it's actually a decade ago, the first thing I did was to invite my colleagues who work in a regulatory environment to come with me to be educated. And then once we got educated, it was a little bit easier. I wouldn't say it's easy, it's just easier to communicate what gene therapy requires and what it means in the local context. And we now have, I think, a set of regulatory frameworks that do not need to be reinvented in Africa. One can just replicate those because some of us have already done it. There's no reason why other parts of Africa, for example, should be starting from scratch. They can simply take what we have and repurpose what we have for the specific environment in which they find themselves. So I think reinventing the wheel is not the best way, but repurposing would be the best way for at least the regulatory environment in Africa. Then the second component of it, I think we are now beginning to understand that there is an element of similarity amongst the regulatory authorities in Africa. Entities such as the African Union, the African CDC could take a lead in harmonizing the discrepant and certainly the divergent practices and making them very streamlined. And that is actually probably going to be the biggest enabler for us to be able to move forward.
Perfect. Completely agree with you. How should health systems balance long-term follow-up, cost considerations, and patient autonomy in gene therapy programs?
I mean, the most important unknown in gene therapy that I alluded to earlier on is the safety. We do know that at least our understanding of the current vectors that we use that they don't integrate, but we don't have a clear picture as to what will happen in the long term. So from the gene therapy perspective and the genomic perspective, it is critical that we establish registries, we establish banks,
Yes.
we
Yes.
establish research programs that are not just cross-sectional, but are longitudinal in addressing some of the unknowns that we are facing at the moment.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes. Looking ahead, I would like to turn to the future of the field. What scientific or technological advances do you believe will most significantly change hemophilia care in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, we've come a long way in the context of the bleeding disorders community and certainly in hemophilia. We've seen unprecedented evolution of the therapeutic landscape that range and moved away from using plasma-derived products to recombinant products to optimize recombinant products. And now, in fact, we're using non-factor therapies and gene therapies. My take on it is that evolution is actually going to come to an end at some stage. Then we need to go back to the drawing board and start to rethink on how do we integrate the various technologies. In other words, look at an individual patient and start to practice precision medicine and individualized medicine. And in fact, with our therapeutic toolbox being relatively full at the moment, it would be very easy to start to focus on the individual patients and practice individualized medicine, as we would want to do, in fact, in medicine in general. Having said that, one needs big frameworks that would enable that environment. And the most important framework, I think, in the context at least of hemophilia, is shared decision making. In other words, it should not be a one-sided approach from technology and those with the know-how, but it should also be educating the patients and their community about what is available. And shared decision making, in my view, is going to be the glue that would actually enable the next phase of the development of therapies in hemophilia.
Yes, thank you so much. Now, what advice would you give to early career researchers and clinicians in Africa who want to contribute meaningfully to advanced therapeutics such as gene therapy?
Absolutely. My advice would be you need to sort of very slowly but surely make up your mind if you're going to be a consumer of knowledge or a generator of knowledge. And I think most people, if you ask them the question, they would want to generate the knowledge. There is clearly in the part of the world where we live, lots of opportunities from the perspective of the pathologies that we see, from the perspective of the volume of patients that we see. So one should not be afraid to basically tackle the difficult bit, which is take a problem, see it logically through a small cohort of patients, and then expand it and make sure that, in fact, there is benefit that is at community and certainly at continental level. My challenge to anyone who's listening to this is that, if some of us can do it, there is nothing stopping anyone from doing it.
Yes, you're right. Completely agree again. Before we conclude, I would like to ask you to speak directly to policymakers. If you were to convey one key message to policymakers to support equitable and sustainable access to gene therapy, what would it be?
So to policymakers, I think they should see themselves as partners with the healthcare community, with the patient organization, as well as with the funders. They cannot be seeing themselves as aloof and not getting involved. And I think the most important message to them is the field of genomics and certainly gene therapy is evolving rapidly, and I would urge them to get educated about these fields because it is not just going to be in hemophilia, it's going to
Yes.
be in a lot more disease areas that we look after, particularly the chronic disease areas. So if they get themselves educated and in fact brought up to speed with what is going on, they will make policies that are fit for purpose in the future.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Johnny Mahlangu, for sharing your valuable insights, experiences, and perspectives with us today. Your work is helping to advance our understanding of gene therapy and its potential, and it's truly inspiring to see how research can translate into meaningful improvements in patient care. To our audience, thank you for joining us today. We encourage you to continue engaging with PAPERI's programs and initiatives as we work together to advance genetics, genomics, and scientific leadership across Africa. Please stay connected with us through our platforms and join us for future edition of the Bright Mind series. Once again, thank you to our distinguished guests, and thank you to our community. We wish you all continued success and inspiration. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting us.